there's a kind of silence that isn't peace. It's the silence of sitting in an office restroom, pressing a paper towel against your eyes because your mascara can't run before 9 a.m. It's that heavy certainty you only get after everything has already shattered, knowing your entire life changed the night before, but the rest of the world hasn't found out yet. I knew it that Monday morning. I knew it while I was washing my face for the second time. I knew it as I adjusted the badge around my neck, with fingers that were still shaking. I knew it as I rode the elevator that smelled like coffee and some executive's cologne, someone whose name I never even bothered to learn. I'd left the apartment with a backpack, a charger, and whatever coat was closest to the door. 4 years. 4 years building a life brick by brick, giving up things I could barely even name. And she was planning to leave. She'd been planning it for months, without saying a single word to me. It wasn't the betrayal that destroyed me that night. It was realizing I wasn't even in her plans anymore. And the worst part? I had nowhere else to go. So let me ask you, even knowing this is a story, but knowing so many women actually go through this, what would you do if you found out the person you shared a bed, a bank account, and your dreams with was planning their exit while still sleeping right next to you? Because I had to answer that question at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. And the only answer I could find was getting into a corporate elevator on Monday morning and pretending I was fine. I'm going to tell you the whole story from the beginning. All I ask is that you like and subscribe for the next ones. My name is Nora Caldwell. I'm 34, I work in IT at a tech firm in Seattle, and for a long time, I was good at one specific thing, making it look like I was okay when I wasn't. It's not a skill you learn on purpose. It's one you develop bit by bit, as you realize the world doesn't stop to wait for you. Meetings happen even when you're falling apart inside. Support tickets keep coming even when your life is collapsing. Jade and I had been together for 4 years. We'd lived in the same apartment for 2. It was one of those relationships that looked solid from the outside. 2 grown women, a tidy apartment, a set routine. On the inside, it was a constant tightrope walk. Jade had a complicated relationship with money, not in an irresponsible way, but in the sense that she could never plan, never stop to think about next month. I was the one holding everything together. I had sidelined a personal project I'd carried for years just to cover the apartment bills. I cut my spending, canceled things I loved, and took on soul-crushing overtime because it's what had to be done. I didn't hold a grudge over it, at least not consciously. But on Sunday night, when I opened her laptop by accident, she'd asked me to grab a password from a digital notepad, and I saw a whole folder titled Portland New Beginning, with apartment spreadsheets, moving cost estimates, even a list of neighborhoods with cost of living notes. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Then it took another moment to feel it. And then the fight came. Not the explosive movie kind with screaming and slamming doors, but that low, devastating fight between people who are already too tired to raise their voices. I asked when she was going to tell me. She said she was still thinking about everything. I asked how long that folder had existed. She went silent. 3 months. She'd been planning to leave for 3 months. I didn't leave in a rage. I left with that feeling of someone who just realized they were the last to know a secret about themselves. I grabbed what I could, left without a word, slept in my car for 2 hours, and then went to work, because I didn't know what else to do. The Mercer Solutions office was on the 17th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle. It was a mid-sized tech company specializing in corporate security, and I'd been there for 2 years as a senior IT analyst. It was a good job. Stable, with health insurance, and a year-end bonus that saved me every time. And it had a CEO I'd learned at great cost not to look at for too long. Sloan Mercer was 38 and had the kind of presence that filled a room before she even stepped into it. It wasn't arrogance. Arrogance I could have ignored easily. It was a combination of focus and a calm I couldn't quite name. She listened to people as if she had infinite time. She made decisions with a tranquility that bordered on unsettling. And for some reason I never fully understood, She always noticed when I was struggling. Not in an intrusive way. She just noticed. Once, months ago, I'd come into work after a long argument with Jade about money. I hadn't said a word to anyone. I'd sat at my desk, opened the systems, and replied to 3 emails. By lunch, Sloane had walked down the hall, stopped at my desk without me calling her, and simply said, "You don't have to answer this now, but if you need to leave early today, you can." That stayed in my head for weeks. On that Monday, I tried twice as hard to look normal. I arrived right on time. I answered good mornings. With a smile I'd briefly practiced in the bathroom mirror. I opened the monitoring systems, started triaging the morning tickets, and drank my coffee. But my brain was somewhere else. I kept stopping in the middle of a line of code to calculate how much a solo apartment in Seattle would cost. I kept opening search windows, typing in neighborhoods, and closing them before seeing the results because the numbers made me nauseous. I thought about calling my mom and immediately scrapped the idea because she'd ask what happened, and I didn't have the energy to explain. By 2 p.m., I'd finished less than half of what I was supposed to. At 3 p.m., I got an internal message. "Nora, when you have a moment, my office." It wasn't unusual. Sloane sometimes called me for technical updates, to review security reports, or to discuss implementations. It was part of the job. But I knew before I even stood up that this wasn't about work. Her office was on the corner of the floor, with a full glass wall overlooking the bay. On clear days, you could see the mountains in the distance. Today was cloudy. That specific shade of gray Seattle gets in the fall, and the light came in filtered and hazy. Sloane was standing by the window when I entered. She turned, looked at me for a second. Just a second, but the kind of second that carries weight, and said, "Close the door." I closed it. She didn't say anything immediately. She walked to her desk, stood behind the chair with her hands on the headrest, and looked at me with that expression I'd learned to recognize as her truly paying attention. "You haven't been able to work today," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to say I'd handled the morning tickets, that I'd done the triage, that... "Nora." She just said my name, and I shut my mouth. "What's going on?" There was a silence, the kind of silence that builds pressure. I looked at the window, at the gray sky, at the houses down below, too small to have distinct windows. And I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that I'd spent the whole day holding everything in, and I was reaching my limit. Maybe it was simply that Sloane asked things in a way that made it very hard to lie. I said, "I ended a 4-year relationship last night." She didn't say "I'm sorry" or "Wow, that's hard," or any of the standard responses. She waited, and I kept going. I told her about the folder on the laptop, about the 3 months of planning I didn't know about the low, heavy fight, about the car. And then, because I'd already gone too far to stop, I told her about the apartment, that it was in both our names, that I couldn't afford it alone, that I didn't want to be there with Jade while she prepared to leave. But financially, I didn't know what to do. When I finished talking, I realized my arms were crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I hadn't even realized I'd taken. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have somewhere to stay this week?" "A hotel," I said, "until I can think straight." She frowned slightly. Not out of disapproval, out of something I couldn't read right away. "I have a spare room," she said. I looked at her. "You have nowhere to go. Don't worry. It's just until you find another place. That way you can look calmly and you won't have to spend these days there with Jade. What do you think?" The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that day. I wanted to say no. Every rational part of me knew that saying yes to my CEO's offer to live in her house was a massive decision. There was hierarchy involved. There were professional boundaries. There was a whole list of obvious reasons to thank her politely and decline. but I was on the 17th floor of a glass building in Seattle, with a backpack in my trunk and less than $400 in my checking account, and the only concrete alternative I had was a week in a hotel that would devour exactly the money I needed for a deposit on a new apartment. "Okay," I said, in a voice that came out smaller than I wanted. "I accept." Sloane's apartment was in Capitol Hill, the right kind of quiet for a place in the middle of the city. A brick building, 60s architecture on the outside, but renovated on the inside, with that balance between vintage and functional that tells you whoever chose the place had both taste and patience. She showed me the room that same day. It was spacious, with a window facing the street, and a queen-sized bed that looked too new for a guest room. I later found out she'd bought it back when her sister visited frequently, and it went unused once her sister moved to Austin. "The bathroom is right there. You have access to everything in the kitchen, and this is the Wi-Fi." She handed me a slip of paper with the password. "If you need anything at all, just ask." With that, she headed off to the office at the end of the hallway, softly closed the door, and left me alone in a room that wasn't mine with a backpack containing enough clothes for 3 days. For the first 2 days, I treated it like a hotel. I'd wake up early, keep everything tidy, spend the day at work, come back, whip up something simple in the kitchen while trying not to take up too much space, and head to my room. I thanked her when she offered something. I declined when I could do so without seeming ungrateful. Sloane, for her part, was exactly as she was at work. Attentive, calm, and completely impossible to read. She woke up before me every day, and by the time I got to the kitchen, the coffee was already made. She didn't draw attention to it. It was just there. On the second night, when I got home from work, there was a pot of soup on the stove. She said she'd made enough for both of us since there were extra ingredients, and asked if I wanted some. Her tone made it easy to say no if I didn't. I wanted some. We ate at the kitchen table in a silence that was, to my surprise, comfortable. She didn't ask about Jade. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked if I'd been able to sleep, if the pillow in the room was okay, or if I needed a different one. They were small questions, but there was a kind of care in them that disarmed me more than anything big ever could. During that first week, I started noticing the details. That Sloane worked late. I'd hear her in her office past midnight sometimes, yet she never looked tired in the morning. That she had a breakfast ritual involving a specific playlist on her phone and a mug that clearly had a history. Worn, with a chip in the handle fixed with superglue, which she hadn't replaced. That she actually read before bed with physical books and everything. That she called her mother every Thursday night. And the conversation lasted exactly 20 minutes. And that she looked at me, sometimes, in a way she immediately withdrew the moment she realized I'd noticed. I should have ignored it. I knew I should. I'd just come out of a 4-year relationship. I was living at my CEO's house out of financial necessity. It was a cocktail of circumstances that screamed, not the time, not the place, not the situation in all caps. But there's something no one tells you about living with someone after a relationship that was, in the end, very lonely. The proximity of someone who is truly present, truly there, not just physically in the same space, is devastating to your defenses. And Sloane was present in a way I couldn't defend myself against. In the second week, I stopped treating it like a hotel. I started leaving my book on the coffee table. I started making coffee for both of us. One Friday night, when she appeared in the living room clearly drained after a 3-hour call, I made tea without asking and set it beside her without a word. She looked at the cup, then at me, and said in a voice slightly softer than usual, "Thank you." Just that. But I went to sleep with that thank you, echoing in a way it shouldn't have. Have you ever felt when something is about to change, not dramatically, but with that quiet certainty that the ground you stood on last week isn't the same ground now? I felt that every morning when I woke up in that apartment, and I didn't know if I should run toward it or get out before it became too complicated to turn back. It was during the third week that she asked me about the dream. We were in the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. She was reading, and I had my laptop open to apartment listings that I kept opening and closing without committing to anything. When she said, without looking up from her book, "You mentioned once that you'd sidelined a project. What was it?" I looked at her. "When?" "In my office on Monday." A pause. "You said you'd given up your own things to cover the bills." I was curious what they were. I waited a moment before answering. It was a small thing to tell. An educational software project I'd started years ago involving accessibility tools for students with dyslexia. I'd stopped when money got tight and never touched it again because it felt too far out of reach. But it was also the thing I'd talked about the least with anyone. Jade knew, vaguely, that I had some tech idea. She'd never asked more than that. I told Sloan. Not the short summary, the whole project, the research I'd done, the references I'd studied, the prototype sitting on my external hard drive that I hadn't opened in 2 years. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's good, Nora. Truly." It wasn't a vague compliment. She said it with the same tone she used to evaluate work proposals. Direct, considered, no fluff. I didn't know what to do with that. I went to my room that night thinking I should put more distance between us, that I was getting too close, that I was confusing things. And at the same time, I knew with that nagging late-night clarity, the last time someone had asked about my project was never. It was on a Tuesday at the beginning of the second month that I heard it for the first time. I was in the break room getting water when 2 co-workers from finance walked in without seeing me. They were in the middle of a conversation that cut off for half a second when they spotted me, the kind of pause that says everything before a single word is resumed. One of them gave a polite corporate smile and said, "Hey, Nora." "Hey." I left with my water bottle and didn't hear what they said next. But I knew. In offices our size, word gets around. I didn't know exactly who had seen what or who had connected the dots, but it was obvious someone knew I was living with Sloan. And in a corporate environment, living with the CEO isn't exactly neutral information. I spent the rest of the day waiting for something to become explicit. A direct question, a weird email, some summons from HR. None of that happened. What happened was different, and in a way, it was worse. Sloan pulled back. Not in an aggressive way. There was nothing I could point to and call cruel. It was subtle and precise, like almost everything she did. A professional distance that reinstalled itself as if it had never left. Internal messages went back to being formal, short, objective, stripped of the tone that had started to emerge over the last few weeks. In a team meeting where she previously would have pulled me into a technical discussion with a look or a gesture, she simply didn't. In the elevator, when it was just the 2 of us, she stared at her phone the entire ride. At home, it was more gradual, but just as unmistakable. She stopped cooking for both of us. The coffee was still made when I got to the kitchen, but she wasn't there anymore when I arrived. The comfortable silence of our evenings in the living room turned into absence. She stayed in her office with the door closed, and as I walked down the hall, I'd hear the muffled sound of work calls or keys clicking. Sometimes I'd sit in the kitchen listening to the silent apartment, and the only thing I could think was, she regrets it. She regretted offering me the room. She regretted hearing about the project, about Jade, about the things I never told anyone. She regretted the soup and the tea and the late nights in the living room. And I, who had been stupid enough to let all of it matter to me, felt exactly how I'd felt in the apartment with Jade toward the end. Present in the space, but absent from the account. Convenient. Not chosen. I know that feeling better than any other. It's the kind that doesn't destroy you with one blow. It destroys you slowly, with consistency. I started looking for an apartment with an urgency I didn't have before. Not because I'd cleared my financial hurdles. I still hadn't saved enough for a comfortable deposit. but because staying in that apartment, becoming invisible to the person who had finally seen me clearly for the first time in forever, I couldn't do that. It was pride, yes, but it was also self-preservation. I opened listings during office hours. I messaged real estate agents. I visited 2 studios during my lunch break. One with a leaking ceiling, another with a landlord who seemed like the type to show up unannounced. I kept looking. On a Wednesday night, I scheduled a viewing for Friday. It was a 1-bedroom in Beacon Hill. Not Capitol Hill, not my favorite neighborhood, but functional, safe, and within what I could afford if I cut back on a few things. I was going to leave at the end of the month. I decided not to tell Sloan until Friday after the viewing. I wanted to be sure before I turned it into a conversation, but the apartment didn't wait until Friday to become the center of my life. Sometimes the moment that changes everything doesn't come with a warning. There's no music swelling in volume. It's just you at 2 a.m, thirsty, heading downstairs for water and finding her there. It was exactly 2:08 a.m. when I went downstairs. I'd woken up with that uncomfortable heat that comes when you spend too much time in the same position overthinking, and my throat was parched. I headed down in my socks, moving slowly, without turning on the hallway lights. The range hood light was on in the kitchen, that low yellow glow designed specifically for 2 a.m., for people who are awake when they shouldn't be. Sloan had her back to me, her hands wrapped around a mug on the counter. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt and socks. She turned when she heard me come in, and neither of us spoke for a few seconds. There was something different in her expression that I couldn't put a name to. This wasn't the Sloan from the office. It wasn't even the Sloan from my first weeks here. She was quieter than any version of her I'd ever seen. I grabbed some water from the fridge. I drank. I leaned against the counter. The silence stretched on, and I didn't pull away, and she didn't leave. After a moment I couldn't quite measure, I said, "I found an apartment. I'm visiting on Friday. If it's good, I'm moving out at the end of the month." She didn't answer right away. She looked at her mug, then at the window, then at me, with that direct gaze of hers that I'd learned to fear because it left no room for pretending. And then she spoke, in a voice I'd never heard from her before. It was quiet in a way that was different from all her other silences. Not a calculated calm, but the voice of someone who is no longer managing what comes out. I pulled back because I got scared. Not of you, of wanting too much. The entire apartment was silent. I just stood there looking at her. There are moments when your brain processes information faster than your body can react, and you stand still not because you don't know what you feel, but because you feel too many things at once to organize a response. I thought about everything I'd interpreted as indifference, as regret, as confirmation that I was just convenient and not chosen. And I realized I'd been reading an entire language wrong, not because I was stupid, but because I was using the dictionary from my previous relationship, where pulling back always meant being discarded. "You could have told me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I know." A pause. "I didn't want to pressure you. You'd just come out of a 4-year thing. You didn't owe me anything, and I didn't want you to feel like I'd brought you here with some kind of agenda. You brought me here because I had nowhere else to go." "Yes." She looked at me. "And because I wanted a reason to have you around. It's both things at the same time. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just didn't want you to leave without knowing." We fell silent again. And then, before I'd consciously decided to do anything, I moved. It wasn't an impulse. It was the kind of movement that happens when you finally stop resisting something that's been building for a long time. I walked toward her. And Sloan, who was calm and contained and managed entire rooms with a look, Sloan took the final step. Her hands went to my face with a gentleness I hadn't expected, and she kissed me with all that restraint I'd felt over the past few weeks finally transformed into presence. The whole apartment was still, the low light from the hood, the two of us in the kitchen in the middle of the night. I didn't know, in that moment, what this was going to become. I didn't know if it would be simple or complicated. And it would likely be complicated, because real things usually are. But for the first time in a long time, I was in the right place at the right time, with the person who actually saw me. And that was enough to start with. Oh, Gemini dis. I must be honest about what happened after the kitchen. It wasn't simple. It would have been easier to tell if the kiss had solved everything, if the next morning we'd woken up in peace and the problems had vanished. But real life doesn't work that way, and that's exactly why this part is worth telling. On Thursday morning, when I woke up, there was a moment of exactly 3 seconds where everything was suspended, before I remembered what had happened, before I knew how to feel. And then I remembered. I went down to the kitchen. Sloane was making coffee. She turned when she heard me come in, and there was an expression on her face I'd learned to recognize as her genuinely not knowing what was going to happen. It was an expression I hadn't seen before, because Sloane Mercer usually knew what was going to happen. It was the face of someone who had truly exposed themselves and was waiting. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning." Silence. "I'm not canceling Friday's viewing," I said. She frowned slightly. "But not because I want to leave," I continued. "Because I think we both need space so that this is a real choice and not a necessity. I don't want to stay here because I have no other option. If I stay, I want it to be because I chose to stay." She looked at me for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's fair." "I also think we need to talk about work," I added. "About what this means there. Not necessarily now, but at some point." "Agreed." And I took a breath. "I'm not afraid. I just want to do this right." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't a full smile. It was that tiny movement I'd learned was the Sloane equivalent of a huge grin. "Me too," she said. "I went to the apartment viewing on Friday. It was actually good. Airy, with windows overlooking a tree-lined street, and a landlord who seemed like the type to respect boundaries. The price was doable. I went back to Capitol Hill with the lease in my bag and didn't sign it. Not because I went back on my decision to have a choice, but because over the next 2 weeks, as we really talked about our expectations, what happened in our past relationships, what I needed to feel safe, and what she needed to keep from closing off, it became clear that I was staying by choice. We were open with HR. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one. Sloane was direct about the situation and the measures needed to ensure that our personal lives didn't interfere with the professional hierarchy. Some people at the office were uncomfortable, some were surprised, some, the ones who mattered, were neither. What I learned during that time was something about myself I hadn't known before. I had spent years in a relationship where I became smaller and smaller to fit into the available space. I'd stopped doing things that were mine. I'd taken on responsibilities that should never have been mine alone, and I'd done it all without realizing it, because it was gradual, because I cared about Jade, because I genuinely believed it was what had to be done. But it hadn't been a choice. It had been erosion. The difference was massive, and I only saw it from the outside. And now I need to answer the question that was behind all of this the whole time. To you listening, you who might have felt you were in a relationship where you became smaller, or who are at a point in life where you no longer know what is your own will and what is just habit, or who never had someone truly ask you about your dreams. The question this whole story is trying to answer is, how do you know? How do you know when a relationship has truly come to an end? How do you know the difference between love going wrong and love that's over? How do you know when someone is genuinely present versus when they're just occupying space? How do you know if what you feel is real or just necessity in disguise? I don't have an easy answer, but I have what I learned by living through it. About relationships that come to an end. When a relationship truly ends, it's usually not a single event. It's a series of small choices. Not to speak, not to ask, not to be there, that accumulate until the space between two people is too wide to cross without effort. With Jade, the end wasn't the folder on the computer. The folder was just the moment I stopped pretending I didn't see it. About the difference between presence and occupying space. Presence is when someone asks you something and you feel like the answer matters to them. Not because they're going to use the information, not because it's polite to ask, but because they genuinely want to know. It's hard to fake for long. The body senses the difference before the brain verbalizes it. About self-discovery. Many women arrive at the realization that they love other women through a long road. Not because they didn't know, often they knew on some level all along, but because the world around them never organized that information in a way that made sense, or because there was a relationship, a life, an identity built that seemed easier to maintain than to question. What usually happens isn't a light bulb moment. It's a series of perceptions that become harder to ignore. A friendship with a different intensity. A woman you see on the street and can't stop thinking about. A feeling that appears in a context you didn't expect. And then comes the moment where you can no longer not know. For me, it wasn't Sloane who started the process. She was the context where I finally stopped fighting myself. But the recognition that I'd spent years in a relationship where I was present in body but absent in soul, that recognition was mine, about me, independent of anyone else, about the fear of wanting too much. Sloane said she pulled back for fear of wanting too much. I understood that in a way I didn't expect, because the fear of wanting too much is the fear of someone who has gone too far once and come out hurt. It's the fear of someone who learned that exposing yourself has a cost. The problem is that not exposing yourself also has a cost. It's just a slower, quieter cost. There is no love, of any kind, without the risk of wanting too much. What you get to choose is who is worth taking that risk with. Today I live in Capitol Hill, in the same apartment, in the same room, which now has more of my things than the guest belongings I brought in a backpack. The educational software project is active again. I work on it on weekends, some nights, with the same playlist in the background that Sloane uses for breakfast because she shared it with me one day and I got attached. The office is still the office, with all the complexity that brings, with the conversations that had to happen and the boundaries that had to be set. It isn't perfect. Sometimes it's complicated. But it's real. And I prefer the complicated real to the simple empty. If you've made it this far, you've stayed with me through this whole story. Through the kitchen at 2 a.m., the withdrawal that felt like rejection but wasn't, the backpack in the trunk, the folder on Jade's computer that changed everything. Thank you for that. Truly. This channel, Loving Voice, exists to tell stories like this. Stories of love between women that are real, complicated, full of hesitation and fear and late nights in the kitchen, and the courage to take that final step, even without a guarantee. If you recognized yourself in any part of this narrative, if something Nora felt resonated with something you carry, then this story did what it came to do. Leave a like if you stayed. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep listening. And if there's someone in your life who needs to hear a story like this, share it. We'll be back soon.